remind you all that the session and the following discussion are being recorded and will be uploaded to the forum's Facebook page, YouTube channel, and Instagram account. Today, we're honored to have with us Professor Carmela Franklin of Columbia University. Professor Franklin is an expert in medieval Latin literature, transmission of texts and manuscripts, hagiography, the Bible in the early Middle Ages, and early medieval Rome. Professor Franklin serves as the chair of the Classics Department at Columbia University. Since 2009, she has been also serving as the trustee of the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, and since 2007 as a member of the editorial board Traditio. Lastly, between the years 2005 to 2010, Professor Franklin served as the 20th director of the American Academy in Rome. He was awarded the Centennial Medal at the American Academy in Rome in 2010 and the Henry Allen Moe Prize in the Humanities by the American Philosophical Society in 2003. Her books include Material Restoration, a fragment from 11th century Echternach in the 19th century Parisian Codex, the Latin dossier of Anastasius the Persian, and early monastic rules, the Rules of the Fathers and the Regula Orientalis. Today, Professor Franklin will talk about her new research, the reception of the Liber Pontificalis in early Middle Ages, and we'll have, as usual, time for questions after the talk. So if you have a question for Professor Franklin, please send me, Mo Hajbi, a message with your name, and I'll ask you to present it, or alternatively, you can send the question and I will read it for you. Professor Franklin, thank you for being here with us, and please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mo. And I want to thank also all the graduate students of the Israeli Forum of Early Medieval Studies, which sounds like a wonderful organization, at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, for inviting me to speak today on the Liber Pontificalis, whose study, I must say, is experiencing a lively revival, even among the speakers of this forum. The Liber Pontificalis, arguably the most important medieval source for the history of Rome and its popes, and for its role as a formative text for numerous institutions of medieval Latin culture, including canon law and political theory and practice, the liturgy and religious cults, has been investigated through various modes. Next, more. The modern, next slide. The modern study of this text goes back to the two great critical editions at the end of the 19th century. That of Louis Duchesne, whom you see here with his cat. That of Louis Duchesne provided with a long and detailed introduction and commentary, constituting a truly full biography of the Liber Pontificalis, from its sources and its beginnings in the early 6th century to the publication of its two-volume edition at the very end of the 19th century. Duchesne presented the Liber Pontificalis as a living text in which every stage, every manuscript, every recension, every printed edition matters for understanding the reception of the papal chronicle and its uses in the communities where it was read, copied, and at times even corrected. Significantly, Duchesne's vast commentary incorporated the fresh material evidence provided by the new field of Christian archaeology in Rome. Next slide. The critical edition, next slide. The critical edition of Theodore Mommsen, the great legal scholar and classicist, who late in life also turned to the study of late antiquity. The critical edition of Theodore Mommsen of 1898 for the Monumenta Germaniae Historica, on the other hand, is a strictly philological edition, concerned primarily with establishing the original version of the text as it was regularly updated by the original anonymous, by the continuing series of original anonymous authors. Mommsen edition is also limited to the pars prior of the text, the first volume, which goes up to 715, a date chosen because an important manuscript and the oldest complete manuscript of the Liber Pontificalis, the so-called Lucca manuscript, Lucca 490, ends with the date 715. So he avoided the manuscript maelstrom of the Carolingian era. A planned second volume was never published. As someone who has worked very closely with the details of both editions, I must confess that I'm an enthusiastic fan, admirer of Duchenne's breadth of vision and engagement with his text, particularly from his point of view as a liberal Catholic priest. But I also, he was put on the index. One of his books was put on the index of prohibited books, for example. But I also recognize the greater philological precision of Mommsen's edition, based in many cases on the work of manuscript studies and collection by earlier scholars at the Monumenta. And I want here to make a small interjection that I have done this work of the history of the earlier text and the transmissions through the manuscripts of the original Liber Pontificalis as a result of my work to do an edition of a 12th century version of the Liber Pontificalis, generally attributed to a follower of Anacletus II, the follower Pandulphus Romanus, Cardinal Pandulphus Romanus, who was the follower of Anacletus II during the schism between Anacletus II and Innocent II of the 1130s. Anacletus II, some of you may know, is sometimes called the Jewish Pope because he came from an old family in Rome, Jewish family that converted to Catholicism. And when I accepted the invitation by the Monumenta Germania to do an edition of this late version of the Liber Pontificalis, I did not intend to study the earlier redactions, what we call the original redaction. But I discovered that the 12th century edition, a fact that no other scholar had noted, actually involves a revision of the early edition. And therefore, that revision needs to be understood and to be fit with to be inserted within the textual history of the redactions that we will talk about today. I won't talk about that tonight, but I look forward perhaps to talking about it at another time when some of you may be present. So next slide more. Duchenne's conclusion, which you see summarized on this slide, despite some disagreements with Mommsen and the Monumenta Germania scholars about the dating of the earliest portion of the Liber Pontificalis, are the ones that are now generally accepted by scholars. And Duchenne really revolutionized the way the history of the text had been seen. Some recent scholars have questioned Duchenne's conclusions, but nobody has received, I would say, great scholarly support. And the reason, I think, is because nobody has had the stamina or the resources to do the work of manuscript collation, the work of philological details that Mommsen and Duchenne have done. And until somebody does that, I think these proposals can be made and discussed and appreciated, but I don't think they will replace completely or even in large part, the conclusions about the dating and the relationship among the various recensions that Duchenne and Mommsen put together. As to repeat to a certain extent more formally, more recent investigators of the Liber Pontificalis have been less concerned with the textual philological issues over which the German scholars of the Monumenta, the French-born Duchenne, who spent his scholarly life mostly in Rome as the head of the École Française, and their followers battled, or the influence often of religious, political, and nationalistic loyalties. Rather, modern scholars have been more interested in elucidating the historical context in which the Liber Pontificalis was used. They have emphasized the reception of the text as documented by the diffusion and the historical context of the manuscripts, rather than the details of the text, in other words. These manuscripts concentrated in Carolingian France, a concentration driven, it is argued, by the interest of Carolingian historiography, as we saw most recently in the important book of Rosamund McKittrick, Rome and the Invention of the Papacy, the Liber Pontificalis, which was published last year. Approached from the large lens of reception beyond Rome, then, the surviving manuscripts show, as Francois Bougard has emphasized, that the Liber Pontificalis loses its nature as a book of contemporary history, constantly updated and revised, and becomes instead a book of history, about the past. Next slide. The most copied version of the Liber Pontificalis is the one that goes up to the death of Stephen II in 757. Half of the manuscripts of the 8th through the 10th century and a third of those from the 11th and the 12th century reach up only to 757. You might remember that Liber Pontificalis from the previous slides ends in 886. Next slide. Let me illustrate this important fact with another slide. Manuscript Vienna 473, copied at Saint-Amand in Frankland, in Francia, for the most likely for the crowning of Charles the Bald copied at Saint-Amand, most likely for the crowning of Charles the Bald in 869, does not go beyond the life of Stephen II that ends in 757. So it stops 100 years before the actual Liber Pontificalis ends. Okay, so the last 100 years are not covered in that manuscript. This manuscript is important and has been much attention has been paid to it because it contains the B recension of the Liber Pontificalis, which includes details of the Pope's relations with the Franks. I had hoped that at the end of this talk, we might have some time to discuss it, this B recension, but I'm afraid I have too much to say in this first part. I have to wait for another occasion for that. Vienna 473 is a large and elegant collection of Carolingian histories. And the Liber Pontificalis in this codex, it's one of these many historical texts, performs the role of a history book, a storage of knowledge on the sacred topography of Rome and its martyrs, on the Christian Roman past, a reference work for canonical and liturgical disciplines. Compare that to a manuscript copied in Rome at about the same time as the Vienna Codex. As the Vienna Codex was being copied at St. Amand in 869, the now lost Farnesiano, which will be the main character of the stock, the Los Farnesianos, which was copied after 847, around 847, and which covers, as far as we know, up to the life of Sergius II, who died in 847. And it's very possible the manuscript about which we know through indirect means, as we'll explain in a moment, may have reached longer. In other words, a manuscript copied around 847 covers up until 847. The death of Sergius II, whose life as contained in this manuscript was written most likely by an eyewitness, a contemporary of the Pope. So in my lecture tonight, I want to give you the results of a more philological approach rather than a more strictly historical approach to the investigation of the reception of the Liber Pontificalis, an approach concerned with the details of its written language and the material details of the original manuscripts that contained it, following in the footsteps of both Mommsen and Duchesne. I will return to Rome itself, the actual context in which the text was conceived and written, and constantly updated at the beginning and at the ending of every pontificate, and where most new recensions were created before their diffusion into the rest of Italy and Northern Europe. This Roman context remains opaque, largely because of the very small number of manuscripts of the Liber Pontificalis and of other texts as well that survives from Rome from this time, a fact frequently mentioned and a subject worthy of a lecture on its own. Still, a close philological study of the manuscript evidence that survives illustrates the dynamic nature of the composition of the Roman texts, of the Roman text, where the Liber Pontificalis remained a living composition, a current chronicle that engaged with Rome's contemporary concerns, while abroad, the Liber Pontificalis served rather as a book of history, a book about the past. I move now to the Farnesianus and to the latest recension of the Liber Pontificalis, the so-called e-recension form of Duchesne, or the Roman numeral 3 recension of Mommsen. So my case centers around a lost manuscript, the so-called Farnesianus, so-called because it was housed at the library of the Farnese family in their Roman palazzo, but has been lost since the early 18th century. We can reconstruct a portion of the text of the Los Farnesianos and also its actual physical appearance, its size, its script in large uncial capitals, its illustrations, thanks to two early modern scholars who studied it before it disappeared. Next slide, slide 7. The philologist Lucas Holste, just so you see what it looked like. This is from a drawing, an image of him. The philologist Lucas Holste, also known as Holstenius, who was the leading humanist of 17th century Rome, and who was the first non-Italian to be the librarian of the Vatican Library from 1653. It was Holste who first discovered the manuscript, already a fragment, and following humanistic philological practice, which we'll investigate more a little bit later, collated the text against his own copy of the first printed edition, so the Editio Princeps, of the Liber Pontificalis, which was published in Mainz in 1602. Holste was planning to make a new edition of the Liber Pontificalis to replace this unsatisfactory Mainz edition. The second scholar, next slide, is Francesco Bianchini, an historian and scientist active in Rome and in the employ of the Barberini family at the time when they were building their extraordinary library, now part of the Vatican Library. Bianchini, in his own edition of the Liber Pontificalis, printed by engraving images of 5 pages of the surviving manuscript as he saw it, facsimile of the manuscript, in other words, which duplicated the actual pages and its handwritten letters in script and size. Bianchini included these engraved facsimiles in his own edition of the Liber Pontificalis, the most significant edition of the Papal Chronicle from the early 18th century, the most important edition of the Papal Chronicle before those of Mommsen and Duchesne. Bianchini's manufacture of these facsimiles is an important event also in the history of the printing and reproduction of handwritten books. First, let us take a quick look at Holste's collations. Holste's, so we can have slides 9 and we can have slide 9 now. Let's look at Holste's collation. This is a reproduction. This is a copy from the Vatican Library today of Holste's collation of 1 page. So you see the printed books and you see the notes in the margin, which are in Holste's hand. The ones that he takes from the Farnesianus are noted in red ink. Here here on this slide and in the next one, let's have the next one as well. Here you see a detail of the previous slide, and you can read in the margin, tung susceptas, for rather et tung suscepit, which is marked in red on in the text, within the printed text, so that tung susceptas already betrays the suscepta. This Farnesianus variant betrays the Latinity of the Farnesianus, a text much earlier, version much earlier than the one that was printed in 1602. The one printed in 1602 was based on a later manuscript of the Liber Pontificalis, also a Roman manuscript. We may come back to it, Vaticanus Latinus 3764, which was copied exactly between 1085 and 1086. So that susceptas is part of the use of the accusative absolute in early medieval Latin texts, an imitation of biblical and ultimately Greek use of the ablative absolute. So let's look at the next one, the next text. So here, and we see in the margin, and the next one, I think I have another one. No, go back to the previous one. I'm sorry. The previous one. This text, yes, Ness. So the next one, please. Yes, here, what you see here in the note, in the right margin, is the annotation, the correction of the word that in the printed edition is detecta. Here we have distecta, the correction from the Farnesianus. And then the next slide, where in the margin, this is not a color reproduction because the manuscript was scanned only in black and white. But the manuscript, I mean, actually the printed copy, but it's considered a manuscript in the Vatican Library because it contains handwritten collation of earlier manuscripts, okay? This approach by Holste indicate his familiarity with humanistic collation, where you take a text that's already been printed, because the humanists mostly used a printed text, and in the margin, you note of the printed text, you note your various variants. Holste was a really very good philologist who has not been included among the great humanistic philologists in the history of philology, I think because he worked mostly with religious texts, not with the text of classical authors. So we need to remedy that. So his work is not only on this manuscript, but on many others, is preserved today in the Vatican manuscript. Holste's collation had convinced both Duchesne and Mommsen that the Los Farnesianus belonged to the most recent recension of the Liber Pontificalis, the E recension. We can look at the next slide. The E recension 03 by Mommsen. As you can see, the summary is that Duchesne and Mommsen to a certain extent, but Duchesne believed that the E recension went back to Lucca, to Tuscany. This localization has been challenged by Lydia Capo, and I think that Duchesne was wrong in localizing it in Tuscany. I think that the beginnings of the E recension also are to be found in Rome. Its origins, it represents, the E recension represents the most recent version of the Liber Pontificalis. We begin to discern it already in the 8th century, in 8th century readings, and it's the one that ends in 886, the first year of Stephen V. And we can look at the next slide, which shows the oldest manuscripts of the E recension. And this list already shows how Rome, that the manuscripts themselves suggest that Rome is the place where the recension was created. The oldest manuscript, the Farnesianus, is absolutely placed in Rome. The next oldest, 3764, was copied between 1085 and 1086. And then we have one from the late 11th century, also from Italy, but from the Abbey of Pomposa. It is now in Modena. And then 3762, which was written in 1142 at St. Gilles, but we know that it was copied from an exemplar that came directly from Rome. So let's look at the language now, at also the next slide. So the Farnesianus, I want to give you some examples of the actual collation of the uses of Holste's collation to establish the history of this text. The Farnesianus sometimes follows the new readings of the new reading of the E recension. That is the wrong reading, because the old reading is considered the correct reading, and any new readings are considered errors. So the Farnesianus at times follows the E recension reading, as we see in the case here, where the Latin says, either free us from his hand. Here we have the Romans begging the Narcissus, begging the emperor and his wife during the wars in the 6th century. They tell the emperor, either free us from his hand, the hand of the Byzantine general, or certainly we and the city of Rome would serve the barbarians. So the correct text is de servimus, we will serve the barbarians, okay? That's correct. The Farnesianus instead says deserimus, which means we abandon the text. And in this case, obviously, the variant is wrong. What the Romans are saying to the emperor, stop the general, or we are going to turn over to the barbarians. We're going to serve the barbarians rather than you. And the other manuscript, another manuscript of the Liber Pontificalis that I just mentioned, also in the E recension, reads as the same variant, deseremus, which actually means we would abandon. So 3762, we know who wrote that, who wrote it and who copied it, had a sense of the better Latinity of the 12th century. So rather than using the present in an if clause, Latin students will know this, you have to use the subjunctive. Okay. Then in some cases, next slide, the Farnesianus instead, in many instances, preserves the correct text of the reading, the correct reading of the older resection, does not have the changes that the E recension, the other manuscripts of the E recensions introduce later in the transmission of this text. So it shows its antiquity again by agreeing in variants with the older text, with the older recension, rather than with the new E recension. And a very good example is this one, where the Church of Santa Croce in Jerusalem, that has been uncovered for a long time, the Farnesianus, like the old text, reads distecta, while the new version, the E recension, reads detecta. Now, distecta is an interesting word because it is a late antique word. It's not a classical word. And so we can understand why this perfectly good late antique word, which was used in the Liber Pontificalis in the later 11th and 12th century manuscripts, was changed from distecta to detecta, which is the classical word. So here what we have is the favoring by the E recension, as we thought we knew before we really started looking at the Farnesianus, had a better Latin text. But these comparison shows that actually the early versions of the E recension, as represented by the Farnesianus, maintained the Latinity in some cases of the earlier text. So the Farnesianus, therefore, is closer than all the other manuscripts in his linguistic details to the older versions. So to conclude, the Farnesianus illustrates textually the antiquity of the e-recension and argues in favor of Rome and against Lucca or Tuscany in the debate about the origins of where the origins of these recensions are found. Even more significant, next slide, even more significant for the point I want to make today is that the Farnesianus preserves, alone of all manuscripts, a version of the life of Pope Sergius II that is different from that transmitted in all other manuscripts of the Liber Pontificalis. It was recognized as such by Lucas Holster, who copied it on the pages he added to his copy of the printed Liber Pontificalis. And you can see there on the very top line of that page from Holster's manuscript, annotated copy of his printed edition, Supplementa in Vita Sergi Secundis, supplements addition to the life of Sergius II. This life of Pope Sergius differs from the Vulgate version transmitted in all other manuscripts of the Liber Pontificalis in two ways. First, it is much more detailed, containing abundant and precise topographic information missing from or highly abbreviated in the other version, and fuller lists of papal donations to local religious institutions. This frequently happens in the text of the Liber Pontificalis. All these lists of gifts by the pontiffs or by kings and emperors to the Church of Rome, they take over pages and pages and pages. Every candelabrum is listed. And so later copiers just shorten it as much as possible. So, but the Farnesianus, life of Sergius II, doesn't cut anything. Secondly, it alone contains the account of the Arab raiding party of August 846, when the Saraceni, the Saracens, managed to land at the mouth of the Tiber, defeated the defending Roman force, and pillaged the churches outside the Aurelian walls, including the Basilica of St. Peter and that of St. Paul. The narrator, who exhibits direct knowledge of these events, lays the blame for the disaster at the feet of Pope Sergius, who is portrayed as a weakling under the sway of his simoniac brother and unable to govern and protect the city. This narrative offers a completely unflattering portrayal of the pontiff. The version of the life of Sergius II transmitted in all the other manuscripts of the Chronicle is shorter, eliding many of the details of the Farnesianus account, and it omits completely the anti-papal passage recounting the Arabs' incursion into Rome's neighborhood. But it ends with the traditional formula summarizing the details of the Pope's ordination and of his death and burial. The reasons behind the double redaction of the life of Sergius II have been debated. Some see it as reflecting conflicts within Rome and the papal court over the role of the Carolingians and the Byzantine rulers as protectors of the papal see. Here, it is important to stress that the rewriting of the life of Sergius fits a pattern of the revision of the text within Rome and the papal court, as is attested also by the two surviving versions of the life of Pope Gregory II, one shorter than the other, and that of Pope Zacharias, rewritten in a version whose biblical echoes present him as a second Moses. The Lombards are supposed to be the new Egyptians. It is also important to stress that the singular life of Sergius II and the Farnesianus offers additional textual support for the manuscript's Roman origins, for it is clear that the Farnesianus version is the first original life of Sergius, reflecting knowledge of the local topography and papal documents, which could only be available to an inhabitant of the city, with access to the papal archives, the scrinium, and the chancery, the vestiarium, and that it was replaced in later manuscript by a blander, less detailed life of the pontiffs. The preservation of the first longer life of Sergius in the Farnesianus speaks to the local roots of this copy of the Liber. Similarly, the accounts of the Arab incursion, its negative portrayal of the Pope, can only be understood as representing local Roman politics. This passage, placed in an awkward position in the middle of an otherwise traditional life, may well have originated as a marginal note, which was at a second stage incorporated into the text, or less likely from a sudden change by author. In any case, such an addition could only have originated in Rome, and its migration into the text is best explained as occurring where the papal chronicle was regularly copied and brought up to date in the papal chancery and related offices. The survival of the negative life of Sergius II is also important for understanding the continuous living nature of the Liber Pontificalis in Rome. It confirms that the revisions executed in Rome have to do frequently with rivalries within the city and the papacy. As executed from within the curia, these revisions reorient or wish to reorient the perspective of the notices to suit the objectives of official history and political alliance, especially as the manuscript, the copy of the chronicle was sent to other parts of Europe. While the examples of the lives of Gregory II and in the life of Pope Zacharias have been noted, scholars of the text have ignored that the disappearance of this version of the life of Sergius II is another example of this tendency of what I might call the real-time story of this text within the city of Rome, which is transmitted by later manuscript transmission. So the next slide is blank, and then we move to the next one, 19, where I want to, I know that we're already at 12:17, where I want to talk a little bit about the visual evidence that is supplied by our second scholar who preserved for us the memory and the evidence of the Farnesianus, Francesco Bianchini, whose engravings we might say is basically icing on the cake for for our confirmation, and that this of this book as this lost book as a book of Rome. First, there is the script, which you see here, these magnificent large uncials, which show great similarities to surviving uncial books localized in Rome from the late 8th and the early 8th century. The Farnesianus, which uses this capital Roman script and was written at no earlier than 847, would be the last piece of evidence, the last book to exhibit this iconic Roman script. In all of the manuscripts surviving from Rome for the second half of the 9th century are written in minuscule, right? The just lowercase in the Caroline version of Roman minuscule that we call Romanesca. So typical, it shows typical signs of late Roman uncials, the flattering of the lines. Maybe you can go to the next slide quickly. And so this is another page. The next one, and the next one. So here we have a slightly enlarged version of the first page, the life of Pope Eugenius. And here what you can follow some of the characteristics of this script, of this late Roman uncial. The flattening of the written lines, they're not as square as older uncials would be. The heaviness of the script, the use of a flattened D, the A with a loop in the shape of a leaf or triangulus, but most noticeable, I think, is the loss of squareness, which is common in other Roman uncial manuscripts, including the use of tall L and T's that we see in this particular on this particular page. So the second, if we go to the next, we'll come back to the next. Second, I want to emphasize the size of this manuscript. The Farnesiano, as it has been calculated, would measure 34 by 23 centimeters, larger than all similar uncial manuscripts that survive in Rome. And I give you here the example of the two that we can most certainly locate in Rome because of the context. One is the Juvennianus Codex, which and the other one is the Agimundus Codex. The Agimundus, if we could go to the next slide, you have seen their sizes there, right? You notice how they are smaller. The Agimundus here in color. We have to remember that this looks much grander than the Farnesianus because the Farnesianus is in black and white. Bianchini could not reproduce the color, but I mean, we have to assume that the initials were painted in the Farnesianus as they are painted here. This is the Agimundus Homiliarii, which is a collection of homily. And we know that it was copied for the church, the Basilica of the Holy Apostles in Rome. The next slide shows a picture from the Agimundus, which the Juvennianus Codex, which was also probably copied for the Church of St. Lawrence, which contains biblical texts. Now, why is the size important? The size important is that the Farnesianus is bigger than these liturgical books. In other words, the Farnesianus rivals these liturgical books in size and competes with them, would compete with them in decorations if we had all the decorations. Let's look. So if we look, if the Farnesianus had survived, we can assume that it would have 104 initial decorations. There are 104 popes up to Sergius II. And Bianchini gives us the initial of both popes, one of Pope Eugenius and one of Pope Paul. And we're going to look at them now. So let's look a bit at the decorations, at the decorated initials. So let's go to the next slide. Here you have a slide of the two initials in the Farnesianus. they seem rather modest compared to the ones in the Agimundus and in the Juvenianus. But I want you to consider, here is the E. I want you to look at them now, and then we'll look at the next slide, which shows the comparison. So what I want you to look is at the style that and by the way, the Agimundus has been enlarged. So we see the Farnesianus at scale, but the Agimundus picture has been enlarged. So what we see here, we have two E's, and the E of the Farnesianus has lost its arms, just as the E of the Agimundus. The point that I'm making is that also I want you to note the use of acantho sleeves. The point that I'm making is that the Farnesianus would fit very, very well in the artistic manuscript culture of 9th century Rome. It's a later representative of it. And if you look at the next slide, we see that the picture of Paul, the first in the Farnesianus, is not very much unlike the picture of the Virgin Mary in the Agimundus. But also more important is that the floral motifs of both the Farnesianus and the Agimundus are very similar. So the surviving evidence then suggests that the Farnesianus was a book of grandiose dimensions and extensive decoration. As I said, Bianchini provides only 2 decorative initials, but we would have had at least 104, all of which must have been colored as contemporary manuscripts surviving from Rome suggest. If it had survived, the Farnesianus, we can look at the next slide, which is not as pretty as, here are more comparison of the Farnesianus with another initial of the Juvenianus to give a sense of what it might have looked like in reality. And the next one now. So the Farnesianus, therefore, would be textually and graphically significant. I have put here the oldest manuscripts of the Liber Pontificalis, and the Farnesianus is not one of the oldest, but would be textually and graphically significant. It would be one of the oldest witnesses of the papal chronicle. Yet what makes it special is that it will reach at least up to the life of Sergius II, who died in 847. So this extension is important. Just a few years before the end of the text in 886. The Liber Pontificalis comes to a complete end in 886. Most significantly, it would be the oldest of the manuscripts of the Recension, which contains the large portion of the Liber Pontificalis. And the Farnesianus would be the oldest known manuscript of the Liber Pontificalis to survive from the city where the papal chronicle was composed over the century. Graphically, as I've shown, the Farnesianus is also significant because was written in large uncials, the latest example of the use of luncheons in the history of Rome. And if we accept, and the only one to survive in uncials, if we accept the Lucca manuscript 490, which contains a portion of the Liber Pontificali text copied in uncial, but they're imitation uncial, they're fake uncials, they're copied in imitation of their Romo example. So in conclusion, and I can, rather than reading, I think I'll go faster if I'll just make my conclusions off the top of my head. The Farnesianus is important because, to my mind, it shows the different nature, the different role of the Liber Pontificalis within the city of Rome. The recensions show the livelihood of the text, and the livelihood of the text was an ingredient of the composition of Rome's Liber Pontificalis. I think all the major recensions of the Liber Pontificalis, including the B recension, which has been claimed was composed in Carolingian France, was in fact prepared in Rome. And we might conclude by saying that the Liber Pontificalis was copied just at a time when the style and the mission of the Liber Pontificalis in Rome was changing. At this time, we have the Liber Pontificalis in Rome taking a turn for a more literary appearance. We have the Liber Pontificalis was now being composed by literati, such as Anastasius, the librarian, Anastasius Bibliothecarius, who was a translator, a famous writer, and a papal diplomat. Also, John the Deacon, who is known for his biography of Gregory I. We have the 12th century, the later 9th century lives, in other words, are written make claims to literary value, which the earlier Liber Pontificalis did not have. So as Rome, as the writing of these texts was going on, the Liber Pontificalis in the Farnesianus presents a book, a physical expression of this revival by its size, by its decoration, by its imitation, if you wish, of liturgical books, just at the time when the later lives, which we have not examined here because they're not included in the Farnesianus, but for all we know, they might have been, the later lives present the popes as holy people, as Francois Bougard and others have emphasized. The last lives of the Liber Pontificalis are in fact hagiographies. They are meant to be read not as, in a sense, true historical accounts, but as hagiographies. And maybe that is one reason, but this change against the traditional view of the papacy presented in the Liber Pontificalis that might help us explain why the Liber Pontificalis was not continued in the later part of the 9th century. So I've spoken for longer perhaps than I should have, but let me end here and answer your questions or comments, observations, criticisms.
Thank you very much for such a wonderful talk. We do have some questions already waiting, but I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned it before to Shachar and myself, that you have 2 more case studies to prove your point that the Liber Pontificalis was a live tradition in Rome, while in other cases it was a historical book. So if you can perhaps say a couple of words about the 2 other case studies, just so that we can get a full sense of your claim. Thank you.
Yes, the other one is actually the way in which the B redaction, the B recension of the Liber Pontificalis was arrived in France. And there we have the evidence of a wonderful manuscript, Cologne 164, which I maintain in an article. I discussed this in an article that was published in a collection, an Israeli-initiated collection, Yannick Fox's book on inclusion and exclusions in Mediterranean Christianity. So I don't have the book in front of me here, I would hold it. There I make the point, I try to prove that this text was written in Rome. And what I would add to that argument is that this manuscript, Cologne 164, was copied, which I now have examined in all of its details, was copied from a manuscript that came to Charlemagne, that was sent from by Pope Leo III to Charlemagne. And I think what that shows is the active reception of the Liber Pontificalis, which the papacy encouraged. In other words, the papacy sent the books out, right? He sends the book out, which then is copied in France and becomes this iconic text. So that's one example. The other one has to do with the creation in the 11th and 12th century of this edition of the Liber Pontificalis that is attributed to Pandolfus Romanus, with which I began, and which shows that, will show, I hope, once I finish all my publications, when I do this edition, that the Liber Pontificalis was started up again. It was started up again by filling in the blanks, and between 886 and the beginning of the 11th century, by expanding the catalogs that survive for that period, and then adding 4 lives of popes at the end of the 11th and the beginning of the 12th century, which end up in 1130. They end with 1130 Pope Honorius II, and this was composed in the 1130s. And there's more to say about this fascinating story, because I think that Anacletus II, the so-called anti-pope, was meant to be part of this renewed Liber Pontificalis, that he would be the real pope, not Innocent II. So these are other 2 examples, and it is from these later examples, particularly from the 12th century redaction, that I think that led me to think of the Liber Pontificalis in Rome as having a different role than it does in other parts of Europe.
Thank you. That is fascinating. Now we have 2 questions from John Osborne, and I will read it. When you say that the Phanesianus included the lives up to at least Sergius II, is the suggestion that there may have been more, and that these were simply not mentioned by Holste or Bianchini? And the second question, is it known that the entire Phanesianus was written in uncial, including the life of Sergius II?
We cannot tell that the entire Phanesianus was written entirely in uncials, because we don't have it. But we have the evidence of Holste and Bianchini, and they make no reference to any other script except uncial. In fact, if you read Holste's description in detail, which we have on his book, which we have on his annotated copy, and which was actually published even by a successor of the Vatican Library, he says uncials, and so we have no reason to believe that it was not written all in uncials. Now, does it go beyond the life of Sergius II? Certainly, it certainly it would have gone to the end of the life. Here, I have to do what I have tried to compute how many more pages it would take written, by counting the line, how many words per line, because the entire Farnesianus has been reconstructed by Levison, the great scholar of the Monumenta. And so I cannot answer that question yet, but I think that it did. And the only way to prove it is to compare what I need to do with the text with what Levison did more with the structure of the manuscript.
Our next question, thank you. Our next question is from Rosamund McKitterick.
Hello, Carmela. Thank you so much.
Thank you to you for your wonderful book.
Oh, that's kind of you. Thank you. Well, it's very exciting to hear you're doing an edition of Pandulphus. I've got a question that's related to John's, because the Farnesianus, I couldn't agree more. I think it's written in Rome as well. In fact, mentioned it in my book, but you've really established that very well. Apart from the uncial issue, is it clear that there were indeed lives between Hadrian I and Sergius II? Because of course one wonders, was it a manuscript? Because the script, the comparanda you showed, are late 8th and early 9th century. So there is, and I suspect that John's question is related to that. Are we absolutely sure what the life of Sergius was doing in that manuscript? Yeah. It's really a very interesting one.
Yeah.
And related to that is the VAT Lat 3764, which you mentioned, Roman, most likely, but that has the other one. So you've got two Roman versions. The connection's sometimes weak. The Vatican manuscript, the 11th century one, that has the other version of Sergius.
Yes, they all do.
You've got two different Roman versions. So it's just a puzzle. And the picture you showed of the Farnesianus with Hosted's comments seemed to be the life of Sergius. He'd said in the Farnesianus, it reads this. Is that right?
Yes, it says it very clearly. Yeah. Absolutely. No, I'm sorry I didn't make that clear. Absolutely, he says it, you see, because of course what he has in his book is 3764. And the last life, I mean, I think we still have to figure out that last life of Stephen V, which is transmitted by 3764 in the longest version. As it's the longest version of the incomplete life of Stephen V is transmitted in 3764, this 11th century manuscript, which is actually very interesting. And I want to do a more thorough study of it because it has annotations in Beneventan script. And the manuscript was copied when the future Gelasius II was the chancellor in Rome, the head of the chancery. And so it would be interesting to see if we can match those annotations with the ones that have been recognized as by the hand of Gelasius by Francis Newton. So, but the point about the last lives is that last life is that it appears in two later manuscripts, but in shorter version. So I think that life circulated in various stages of completion. And what we have in 3764 is the most complete version, which is the Roman version. In other words, that while books, manuscripts with a shorter version of that last life were circulating in other parts of Rome, of Europe, of Italy, but there's one French manuscript that in Rome they have the Roman manuscript as the latest version, which also argues for 3764 being copied in Rome. But a lot of puzzles.
Yeah, it's obviously lots of problems still. There's just one thing I wanted to add. When you were talking about the P with the portrait from the Farnesianus, of course, that P initial for the life of Paul also comes up in Lucca 490. Which was copied from, which you have pointed out.
8th
century exemplar reaching Lucca with the P in it.
No, and I know that. I mean, I appreciated that. I simply did not have time. I do not have a good picture of that. Otherwise, I would have. I do not have any good pictures of Lucca. Otherwise, I would have put it up. But I know that you made that point, with which I agree completely. Thank you.
Okay.
Our next question is from Shaha Olinsky.
Thank you, Professor Franklin, for this very interesting talk. I wonder, maybe it's a bit of a more of a general question. I wonder to what extent it can actually be answered. But if, let's say, considering the Liber Pontificalis in Rome acts as a living history being written, and in other places more of a frozen, something that happens in the past and has more to do with identity, perhaps. I wonder what it can teach us about the relationship between Christians in different places or different communities, different cultures, and the bishopric of Rome and its authority throughout the early Middle Ages, or the few hundreds of years of its transmission.
It's a very good question, because you're really asking a question about what is the fundamental nature of this text, and how was it being presented, in fact, to define Christianity. And of course, as Rosamond has explained so thoroughly in her book, this was a formative text. It defined Christianity, it united Christians, because it was a source for a common law, it was a source for the liturgy. In other words, it was creating a liturgical standards when there were no liturgical books yet, when there were no liturgical texts as we're going to have. So it's certainly a text that I think unites and creates community. And I completely agree with that. And, you know, Brian Stock wrote about, you know, the communities of the text. And this is a text that was extraordinarily important for portions of Europe. But was it so important for other sections? For example, Monte Cassino really does not have a good, doesn't have any real manuscripts. There is no real evidence that Monte Cassino had even a copy of the Liber Pontificalis. We know in the 11th century that Leo of Ostia was wondering what happened after a certain date. You know, he did not have any manuscripts. So, and while we can explain the absence of manuscripts from Rome and Italy because of war and disaster, certainly the Lateran had a great library, which, as Giovan Battista de Rossi, the great archaeologist, has illustrated, was disappeared, was destroyed. Still, it makes me wonder. It makes me wonder what the text, how the text was used in other areas except for Francia. The use of bead is interesting also, but you know, but that is at the very beginning almost of the transmission. We know that Bede had access to Liber Pontificalis, Gregory of Tours, but the evidence from England is again very low. It's very low. So it's a very important question, and only a partial answer. Thank you. It's a good question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shaha. Our next question comes from Manu.
Manu.
Hello, Carmela.
Hello, Manu.
I have a question about the different versions. If you put the text in these versions in, say, 3 parallel columns, and then you read from left to right, what changes do you see? I mean, are the earlier biographies identical across? Is the only difference in terms of chronological extension?
No, there are changes in words, there are additions, there are some lives appear are shortened in, let's say, the B recension from the A recension, the oldest recension. No, there are significant changes. The question, there are changes. The issue really is why were these revisions? Why did these revisions take place? And
where did the revisions take place?
Well, the recensions, I think, were expanded in Rome. So I think that the classic recensions go back to Rome. But then, for example, we have, changes that are willful changes. For example, if I could talk about this 12th century redaction, it's extraordinary, the changes that the author, who I think it is, Pandulfus Romanus, this follower of Anacletus II. For example, this is a significant change. In his life of Gregory VII, so one of the added lives in this new redaction, in the lives of Gregory VII, he actually makes a change in the document, in an archival document. When he cites the electoral procedure by which Gregory VII was elected, rather than the register of Gregory VII that we have the original, I mean, not, we have almost contemporary copies. The register copy reads that Gregory VII was elected on the day of the burial of his predecessor, which is illegal, right? You have to wait 3 days. You have to wait 3 days before a new papal election. So our old friend, Pandulfus Romanus, when he cites that decree, he puts tertio die. He corrects it because since in his case, in the case that affects him, affects his patron, Anacletus the second, the big issue was the election, but particularly the big issue was in the election of Honorius II, whom Pandulfus abhors, and who was elected without waiting the 3 days, as he tells us in his biography. So there we can see that a writer, a papal diplomat, the head of the chancery, in writing the life of Gregory VII, is actually altering an archival document. So that is what when you really read these texts at this granular level, you come across something like that. So, and that's how we need to read all these various revisions. Every variant is important. Some you can understand are done by mistake, but that's what Mommsen taught me, that his apparatus criticus is much more thorough than Duchenne. I love Duchenne, but Mommsen, you know, is really philology at its best. And because this was a talk that was initiated by graduate students, that's why I chose to concentrate on looking at the text at the granular level. You really have to do that. And we don't do that enough in my mind. We need to do more of that. It takes time, effort, it's boring, you know, but that's the only way we really can answer your question. Too long an answer.
Unless we have some more questions. All right, so please join me in thanking Professor Carmela Franklin for a wonderful and stimulating talk. Thank you.
I've enjoyed myself, I must say. Cheer me up in these dark days. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our next meeting, sorry, you were saying something.
I wanted to thank the two of you, particularly Shahar and Moore, for being so kind and welcoming.
Thank you. We have a lot of fun, don't we, Shahar? Our next meeting will take place on January 26, 2022. Our next speaker is Professor Eric Goldberg of MIT, who will give a talk about Franks, Vikings, and the transformation of Carolingian warfare. We will circulate the flyer soon, and in the meantime, we wish you a happy holiday season and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Itzhak.
Bye, bye, bye. Thank you.
Tamar, see you in New York. Thank you.